Hi, I'm Dr. David Parsons and welcome to this MindLab screencast on top 10 learning theories for digital and collaborative learning. So what's a learning theory? Well, it's a theory about changes in our observable behavior. And the things we look at in a learning theory are how these changes can become relatively permanent, whether the changes are immediate or potential, what role experience plays, and what aspects of reinforcement are present. These are all common themes in different theories of learning. So here are 10 learning theories, and of course there are plenty of others that are not included here. I've just chosen those that I think are most appropriate when we're thinking about digital and collaborative learning. They're not really in any particular order of importance, although they are rather loosely in order of date. So we'll be going through these 10 theories one at a time. Let's begin with conditioning. Conditioning and behaviorist theories are very common in psychology. Perhaps two of the most famous versions are classical conditioning by Pavlov and instrumental or operant conditioning by Skinner. Pavlov, as you may know, did experiments with dogs where he used a bell to cause them to salivate, having conditioned them to expect food when they heard the sound. We don't tend to use these types of classical conditioning approaches explicitly in the classroom, but implicitly they tend to happen quite a lot. Skinner's approach was somewhat different from Pavlov's. Rather than something we do to an animal leading to a behavior, in his experiments, something the animal did led to a result which then further reinforced that behavior. The classic example was putting an animal in a box and getting it to press a button to receive some food. The animal then associated pressing the button with food, even if food did not always appear. This might sound all rather mechanistic, but Skinner had quite a few theories that apply to education. For example, he suggested that learners need rapid feedback to work at their own pace, and, from a digital perspective, he came up with the idea of programmed learning and the teaching machine, so he had lots of ideas that apply today to e-learning. Here's a quote from Skinner on behaviorism. The ideal of behaviorism is to eliminate coercion, to apply controls by changing the environment in such a way as to reinforce the kind of behavior that benefits everyone. Here's our next theory, Connectionism, not to be confused with Connectivism that we look at later, and the law of effect. Thorndike was probably the first of the real educational theorists. His concept of Connectionism was a neural bond between stimulus and a response, so it had a lot in common with the conditioning and behaviorist approaches. He felt that learning was incremental rather than insightful, so had to be built one step at a time. Another idea he came up with was the law of effect, that is, reinforcement increases the strength of a connection, but punishment does not change it, really emphasizing the importance of positive rather than negative reinforcement in learning. Here's a nice quote from Thorndike in 1912 on telling and showing. The lecture and demonstration methods represent an approach to a limiting extreme in which the teacher lets the pupil find out nothing which he could possibly be told or shown. They ask of him only that he attend to and do his best to understand questions which he did not himself frame and answers which he did not himself work out. They try to give him an educational fortune as one bequeaths property by will. I think that's quite a progressive viewpoint for 1912. Another very well-known educationalist is John Dewey, who founded progressive education as a concept. A number of ideas that were important to him were self-governing learners, teachers as guides, outdoor education, the scientific study of how individuals develop with a focus on the individual learner, and cooperation between school and home. He also advocated hands-on learning and experiential education, and Dewey is still very influential today. He was an interesting guy. Among other things, he headed the commission that cleared Trotsky of allegations from the Moscow trials. Experiential learning is developed from Dewey's work, which emphasized that we don't learn from the experience itself, but from reflecting upon it. And the key concept that's kind of grown out of Dewey's original ideas tends to be that experiential learning has a cycle of stages. And we can see that from theories by people like Kolb, Schwartz and Deming's plan, do, reflect, act. And this is kind of all built on some of Dewey's original ideas. Here's a quote from Dewey on thinking in education. Methods which are permanently successful in formal education give the pupil something to do, not something to learn, and the doing is of such a nature as to demand thinking, or the intentional noting of connections. Learning naturally results. Another very famous educational theorist is Lev Vygotsky, whose work was really not known in the West till well after his death in 1934, but he's really the father of Constructivism. With his social development theory, he emphasized social learning and felt that it preceded development, which, as we'll see, is rather different from Piaget, who's also another constructivist who looked at developmental stages. Vygotsky came up with two very important concepts, the zone of proximal development and the more knowledgeable other. The zone of proximal development is the area between what the learner can do independently and what they can do with help from others, and those others are known as the more knowledgeable other. That's someone or something who knows more than the learner, and it might be a teacher or a peer, but it could equally be a computer. Vygotsky is seen as a social constructivist, an approach that emphasizes the roles of others and culture in constructivist learning. Here's a quote from Vygotsky talking about the zone of proximal development. It's the distance between the actual developmental level as determined by independent problem solving and the level of potential development as determined through problem solving under adult guidance or in collaboration with more capable peers. Another aspect of constructivism is equilibration, which is Jean Piaget's approach to constructivism. What's important about Piaget is his concept of intelligence and the environment. So intelligence is dynamic, and this equilibration idea is the continuous drive towards balance with the environment. Piaget is well known for coming up with the concepts of 4 stages of development: sensory motor, pre-operational, concrete operations, and formal operations. One of the important ideas from Piaget in education is that educational environments should provide the opportunity for discovery by the student. Here's a quote from Piaget that seems very contemporary in the age of fake news and conspiracy theories. The great danger today is of slogans, collective opinions, ready-made trends of thought. We have to be able to resist individually, to criticize, to distinguish between what is proven and what is not. So we need pupils who are active, who learn early to find out for themselves. Albert Bandura is well known for social cognitive theory, and his main contribution to theory was the idea that observation and modelling can give you the same learning as direct experience. He talks about reciprocal determinism, a dynamic interplay between the person, the environment, and behaviour. In this theory, teachers act as models because they're demonstrating behaviour. On the other side of the equation, Bandura also talked about the fact that media can affect behaviour in a negative way, for example violence in films and on television. Bandura wrote about observation. Coping with the demands of everyday life would be exceedingly trying if one could arrive at solutions to problems only by actually performing possible options and suffering the consequences. A more recent but equally important theory is situated cognition, primarily by John Seeley Brown, although his key paper was written along with Collins and Dewey. In this theory, learning is embedded in the activity, context and culture in which it was learned, and learning, while interacting with others, is done through shared activities and language. The important concept here is that learning is about performance in situations rather than just an accumulation of knowledge. Here's a quote from John Seeley Brown on knowledge. Instead of pouring knowledge into people's heads, you need to help them grind anew a set of eyeglasses so they can see the world in a new way. Distributed cognition takes learning outside of the individual and links both to others and to technology, a theory that seems increasingly relevant to today's learning context. Edwin Hutchins' book, Cognition in the Wild, uses ship navigation as its main context of study of cognition, spanning multiple individuals and technologies. Hutchins also emphasizes that cognition is a cultural process. For example, he compares Western views of navigation with how Pacific Islanders have historically navigated across oceans. Here's a quote from the editor of a journal special issue on distributed cognition and education. The point to be made about distributed cognition, both historically and today, is that learning is cognitive and social. As such, teachers have a considerable impact on their learners, not only in terms of the things they say and do, but also on the tools they select for instruction. Constructionism. Seymour Papert's a very important theorist in terms of digital technologies. Papert worked with Piaget and followed many of his ideas. His concept of Constructionism is related to Constructivism, but is very much about the creation of artifacts, learning by doing, utilizing both physical and virtual materials, for example electronic media, to creatively develop abstract learning. Papert was involved with many revolutionary ideas in educational technology, including Logo Turtles, the One Laptop Per Child program, Lego Mindstorms, and Alan Kay's Dynabook, which was the first vision of today's tablet computer. So he was a major contributor to learning technology and its concepts. Here's a nice quote from Papert on digital technologies and learning. But nothing could be more absurd than an experiment in which computers are placed in a classroom where nothing else is changed. The entire point of all the examples I have given is that the computers serve best when they allow everything to change. The community of practice is a very important concept when we're looking at collaborative learning, and the main researchers in this area have been Jean Lave and Etienne Wenger. The community of practice has three components: the domain, the community, and the practice, and the learning is seen as unintentional or informal, situated within authentic activity context and culture. It's all about the social relationships and the co-participation, so it's very much a theory of collaborative learning. Here's a quote from Wenger on communities of practice. Communities of practice are groups of people who share a concern, a set of problems, or a passion about a topic, and who deepen their knowledge and expertise in this area by interacting on an ongoing basis. A more recent theory, and perhaps a slightly controversial one, is Connectivism, which was developed by George Siemens. He describes it as a learning theory for the digital age, and it takes into account the idea that internet technologies have created new opportunities for people to learn and share information, and that learning can take place across online peer networks. To demonstrate that concept, Siemens launched the first massive online open course, or MOOC, in 2008. Here's a quote from Siemens from his first article on Connectivism. Connectivism presents a model of learning that acknowledges the tectonic shifts in society where learning is no longer an internal, individualistic activity. How people work and function is altered when new tools are utilized. The field of education has been slow to recognize both the impact of new learning tools and the environmental changes in what it means to learn. So that's my top 10 learning theories. These are the references that are scattered throughout the slides. I hope you find this a kind of inspiring overview of these theories, and I hope it inspires you to look a little bit deeper into some of these theories. Ka kite.